The Executive in the Federalist, Lecture 3. Having now talked about the need for energy in the executive, the basic structure of the executive branch, how to render the executive power properly accountable to the people through having a single president who is at the top of the chain of command within the executive branch. Having talked about all those things, we now come to the ingredients of energy. So if energy means the capacity to act quickly, decisively, and forcefully, then the question becomes, how do you organize the executive branch so that it is capable of acting quickly and decisively and forcefully? And there are 4 ingredients, which he lays out, 4 elements, you might say, of executive power that aim at creating an energetic executive. And those were mentioned already on page 422 in Federalist 70. Unity, duration, adequate provision for support, and competent powers. That's on page 422. Those are the 4 ingredients. So in this lecture, I'm just going to go through and talk about what exactly those ingredients are. So unity, which is discussed in Federalist Paper 70. This means, again, one president, one person in charge of everybody under him. This allows for energy because it is much easier for action to be taken if it requires the decision and the orders of one person rather than the deliberation of a council or agreement between more than one person, right? So the more people you have to involve in the making of a decision, generally speaking, the longer it takes for a decision to be made. And so if the goal of the executive is to be able to act quickly, then you want the president to be able to make decisions quickly, to act quickly. And so in order to make the president act quickly, you want to minimize as much as possible the number of decision makers involved in making a decision. And of course, what you do is you choose one. Because if, say, some people say, well, look, in Rome, they had 2 consuls, right? So instead of having a king, they had 2 consuls. And Hamilton basically says, well, yeah, but actually what they did is one consul was out, somewhere else in the empire in charge of things, and one consul was in Rome. That for the most part, having 2 consuls running everything as equals, they didn't really do that. And it's clear why, that there's a real problem. If you have, say, a dual presidency, then you have a real potential for gridlock. Anytime there's disagreement about what's to be done, you're at a standstill, and the executive can't act until these 2 presidents agree. But when you have kind of proud, ambitious people, which is usually the kind of people that are attracted to the office of the presidency, anytime that there's a disagreement over policy, they're going to make it a point of honor to be the one who's right. They're not going to be, the kind of people who seek to be president are not the kind of people that tend to back down in the face of disagreement. They tend to be the people who want to be in charge, who want to be right, who want to call the shots. And so when you have 2 of those people who both want to be calling the shots and they disagree about what's to be done, you're at a standstill. At best, you're at a standstill. You're actually possibly, having a dual executive could set the country up for some kind of faction, according to him, where the partisans of one president and the partisans of the other president become foes to one another. So you actually introduce the spirit of rivalry and faction into the very heart of the executive branch and paralyze it by having 2 executives. And it'd be even worse if you had an executive council of more than 2. So you want one person who, in the words of George W. Bush, is the decider, the person who ultimately is responsible. And of course, this increases responsibility too, as noted, because you know who will hold responsible. So unity is absolutely essential for energy, to make a decision and act, right? The more people you have involved in doing that, the slower things go, the more likely it is that nothing will get done. And if you have only 2, you still have the possibility of faction, rivalry, and gridlock. So what you really need is one executive. But that's just one aspect of energy. Besides unity, the second ingredient, which he talks about in Federalist 71, is duration. And by duration, he means the 4-year term, that the person who, at the least, really, in Federalist 71 and 72, he defends not only the 4-year term for president, but the fact that the president can be reelected over and over again. So, in other words, one president who can hold on to the office for a while. And duration is another important part of the president's ability to act quickly, decisively, and forcefully. And here, especially, where he talks about firmness, what he's talking about is the way that holding the office for a relatively long period of time makes it possible for the president to stick to the decisions he's made and carry them out, right? Part of executive energy lies in firmness, making a decision and keeping to it, not changing policies or priorities from day to day or week to week and kind of flittering about with no kind of general direction. A lot of what government does in the administration of the laws, but also in its relations with foreign countries and diplomacy and stuff like that, a lot of what government does can be accomplished only over time, acting steadily according to a plan. Right. So a lot of, especially like in foreign relations, good foreign relations oftentimes rely upon the sticking to a plan over time. That if you're constantly changing what you say, constantly changing what you want, it becomes extremely difficult to conduct foreign relations. It becomes extremely difficult to have any uniform policy for executing the law. So in that same way that it's good for there to be stability in the legislature, which is had by having senators serve for a long period of time and having staggered times for re-election, you have the same sort of desideratum with respect to the president. You need to give the president time to formulate and carry out plans without things shifting around constantly. Now, Hamilton also argues that a 4-year term is really the minimum necessary time for executive policies to be firm, to remain kind of constant and consistent. If you replace the president any more often than 4 years, our major policies and priorities could be changing so often that no long-term plans could ever really be accomplished, and no other country would really take our commitment seriously. Yeah, this president's saying this, but there's going to be a new president in a year, and who knows what he's going to say, right? So you need that duration. And as I mentioned, he defends even multiple terms beyond 2 terms. But part of what this means, though, and part of the concern that some people had, and this is similar to what happens with the Senate, is that when you give the president a 4-year term, that is meant to render him partially independent, both of the will of the people and the will of Congress. That once he's in office, he's like, I'm here for 4 years. I can do what I think should be done. And even if it's not popular in the moment, I can hope that the wisdom of my policy will become apparent, and so that the people will eventually realize that I'm right. If you have to stand for re-election every year, politicians become extremely risk averse. They become much less averse to appearing to be out of touch with public opinion, because they might get punished soon, at the polling station for being seen as out of touch. So the shorter your terms are, the more risk averse politicians are in terms of being willing to buck public opinion, even when they think that public opinion does need to be opposed. And so the remedy for that, if you want presidents to be able to exercise independent judgment and not simply be enslaved to every shift in public opinion, is you have to give the president some independence from public opinion by giving the president some insulation from election time. So you need at least a 4-year term. So yeah, that does make it possible for the president to do things that are not broadly popular. But Hamilton says that's a good thing. The people aren't always right about what the public good is. This is on page 430 to 431. And here's what he says. There are some who would be inclined to regard the servile pliancy of the executive to a prevailing current, either in the community or in the legislature, as its best recommendation. So notice some people would say a good executive is a person who's going to be consistently and quickly responsive to the opinions of Congress and to the opinions of the people. And the reason why he mentions Congress here is because obviously Congress as a body are the representatives of the people. So the idea is, in popular government, public opinion should matter. And that means that the executive should care about and respond to public opinion, whether it's expressed directly by the people or whether it's expressed by the people's representatives in Congress. And Hamilton will have nothing of this. He says, but such men entertain very crude notions, as well of the purposes for which government was instituted, as of the true means by which the public happiness may be promoted. These people don't really understand the purpose of government and how it achieves those purposes. The Republican principle demands that the deliberate sense of the community should govern the conduct of those to whom they entrust the management of their affairs. So, in other words, when there are areas where the opinion of the people as a whole is very clear and very stable, a kind of a deliberate sense that that the community over time, after thought and experience, consistently thinks a certain way, then in a Republican government that should be honored. When the public has clear, stable preferences, those preferences should be honored since the people are sovereign. So for example, to kind of use this example against Hamilton, it's very clear that although he thought it was a great idea for presidents to be reelected over and over and over and over and over again, it's very clear that by the time of Thomas Jefferson and thereafter, that the deliberate sense of the community was that presidents should only serve for 2 years, and so that was honored. It's not in the Constitution, but it was clearly part of our political culture, and so it was honored. The only one who didn't honor it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he was president during extraordinary times of both depression and war. Under normal times, it is extreme, to my mind, this is counterfactual, but I consider it extremely unlikely that under more normal times, Franklin Roosevelt would have sought a third and a fourth term as president. So the deliberate sense of the community should win out. But here's what he says. But it does not require an unqualified complaisance to every sudden breeze of passion or to every transient impulse which the people may receive from the arts of men who flatter their prejudices to betray their interests. It is a just observation that the people commonly intend the public good. This often applies to their very errors. But their good sense would despise that adulator who should pretend that they always reason right about the means of promoting it. So in other words, the people always want the public good, but they don't always know how to get it. And only a base flatterer would actually claim that the people are always right. Even the people know that they're not always right. To give an example, in Washington's second term, France and England are at war, and you have a lot of people in American society who say, "Hey, we should support the French in their war against the English. France supported us in our revolution against England. They paid a great price for doing so. We really owe it to them, and also they've had a revolution. They're a republic now, so we fight for the same cause. We should give them support. They're our natural allies. They're fighting against our former oppressor. This is a no-brainer. Let's help out France." Whereas Hamilton and Washington and some others basically argued, look, I understand all that. That's really popular. It sounds really good, but it's just wrong. We are too weak as a nation to risk incurring the wrath of Great Britain by supporting their foe right now. So however much we might like to help France, however popular the idea might be, we cannot act on it because it would be ultimately extremely harmful to the long-term welfare and even independence of the United States. And so Washington declared neutrality. It was not popular, but the wisdom of that policy came to be seen. So that's what Hamilton's talking about, that even though you should always serve the public good, even though the deliberate sense of the community should be honored, that doesn't mean that every shift in public opinion polls has to be honored, right? The public opinion can shift around a lot, and it's not always right. As he says, right a few lines down from there on page 431, when occasions present themselves in which the interests of the people are at variance with their inclinations. So in other words, when the people really want something that's not actually good for the country, it is the duty of the persons whom they have appointed to be guardians of those interests to withstand the temporary delusion in order to give them time and opportunity for more cool and sedate reflection. So, in other words, it is the duty, this is the trustee model, it is the duty of the president to oppose public opinion when he genuinely believes that following public opinion would do harm to the country. So, That's why you need duration. So you need duration. You need a longer term, both in order to be able to formulate and implement, medium and long term plans. And you need duration to give the president some insulation from public opinion so that he can do what he believes is right, even if it's not popular at the moment. So now we get to, so that's unity and duration. Now we have the last two ingredients of energy, which can be put much more quickly. The third requirement is adequate provision, which he talks about in Federalist Paper 73. By adequate provision, what he means is the president's personal salary should not be subject to alteration while he's in office. And that's mandated in Article 2, Section 1. So Congress sets the salary for the president, but Congress cannot be allowed to increase or decrease the president's salary while he's in office. Now, this is not about the budgets of governmental departments. This is about the money that the president earns, because the assumption here is that while a person is president, they can't be doing their normal job. So they're going to need money to support themselves personally. And this was back at a time when the executive branch was much more modest. The president didn't have security details and a White House staff and all of that kind of stuff. So the president needs money to live on. Congress gets to set the salary, but if Congress can alter the salary while the president's in office, that gives Congress the power to manipulate the president's will. We talked about this in the lecture on Federalist Paper 51. So instead, the Constitution mandates that the president's salary is fixed. That Congress, while the president is serving his term, Congress cannot seek to bribe the president by promising to increase his salary if he does something that Congress likes. And Congress cannot threaten the president by threatening to cut or eliminate his personal salary, his means of livelihood, if he does something that Congress doesn't like. So so giving Congress the power to manipulate the president in this way would not only violate the separation of powers, but it would destroy what Hamilton is talking about in terms of executive energy. Because if energy means being able not only to make a decision, but to be resolute, to stick with it, to be decisive, then obviously a president that can be manipulated by Congress can't be decisive. Might make one decision and then Congress threatens and changes his mind. Right. So in order for the president to be able to act firmly and decisively in executing the law and in representing the country and its relations with other countries, he can't have all of his decisions subject to manipulation by any outside power, but especially not by Congress. So you've got to have a fixed salary, which is what adequate provision for support means. So unity, duration, meaning at least 1 4-year term, adequate provision of support, meaning a fixed salary, and then the last one is competent powers, and this can be covered very quickly. By competent powers, he means both that the president should be constitutionally invested with the powers he needs to execute the laws and to protect the country. So you just got to make sure that your Constitution actually gives the president the powers that he needs, and those are laid out in Article 2. But then also there's the more particular power, which is the power of the veto. Now, the veto is important as part of the competent powers because, again, the veto gives the president the capacity to defend himself against Congress, and especially against congressional legislation that might encroach too much on legitimate executive authority. So the veto helps to maintain the separation of powers. The veto helps the president to be able to, in effect, defend decisively the way that he is doing things in office. Obviously, if the president is doing things that are genuinely bad, the president can be removed from office. So we're not talking about giving the president complete independence from the community, but for the sake of separation of powers and for the sake of energy in the execution of the laws, you need to make sure that the president's decisions, the president isn't constantly being whipsawed by public opinion, by Congress, by all these people trying to change what he's doing. So the veto is an important part of that. So alongside just being invested with the necessary powers to be the chief executive and the commander-in-chief, he also has to be invested with the power of self-defense. That's the veto. Now, the interesting thing that Hamilton adds is that although Federalists, other places, the veto is oftentimes talked about primarily in terms of a power of self-defense, but Hamilton also says, the veto also gives the president the power to improve legislation, that the president can veto bad laws. He talks about that on page 442. Now, somebody might object, hey, well, if the president has the power of the veto, yeah, maybe he can veto bad laws, but it also gives him the power to veto good laws. And Hamilton's response to that is basically, well, that's a gamble that's worth taking. If you look at page 442 for this, where he says this. It may perhaps be said that the power of preventing bad laws includes that of preventing good ones, and may be used to the one purpose as well as to the other. But this objection will have little weight with those who can properly estimate the mischiefs of that inconstancy and mutability in the laws which form the greatest blemish in the character and genius of our governments, right? Unstable laws. We talked about that with Federalist 62. They will consider every institution calculated to restrain the excess of lawmaking and to keep things in the same state in which they happen to be at any given period as much more likely to do good than harm, because it is favorable to greater stability in the system of legislation. The injury which may possibly be done by defeating a few good laws will be amply compensated by the advantage of preventing a number of bad ones. So in other words, insofar as stability is a very important thing in legislation, the veto helps to improve the stability of our system, because obviously the president can't write laws. The primary effect of the veto is to prevent new laws from being made. Preventing new laws from being made means just keeping the existing laws in force as is. So although it is true that the president might use the veto to veto some good laws, on the whole, the net effect of the presidential veto is going to be to give the system a greater stability, where stability is a good thing. So, unity, duration, adequate provision of support, competent powers. You give the president those things. You make one president at the top of the chain of command in the executive branch. You give that president time to formulate and implement plans, and at times to perhaps withstand temporary opposition in public opinion. You make sure that the president's salary is fixed so that he can't be financially manipulated by Congress into changing his plans. And you make sure that the president is given the powers he needs and also the power to defend himself from congressional manipulation. If you do those things, you will have an energetic executive. And if you have an energetic executive, then to the extent that this can be designed ahead of time on paper, you have an executive branch that is maximally designed for consistent and strong enforcement of the law domestically and forceful defense of the life, liberty, and property of the people against both internal threats and external threats. And that is Hamilton's vision of the executive. So there you go.